Imagine being confined for more than a year. No open windows, no solid ground beneath your feet, surrounded by thousands of animals breathing, eating and moving, day and night. The heavy air, the constant sounds, the permanent uncertainty. To what extent could resist the human mind in those conditions? The story Noah's Ark is usually told as a moral tale, a lesson about obedience and faith, but it is rarely examined with a key question. How did it really work inside? According to the biblical story, a gigantic wooden structure was built with millimeter precision to withstand the biggest water catastrophe in history. In its interior, human beings and animals, they lived together for 370 days, without modern technology, without engines, without artificial ventilation, without purification systems, and yet they survived. For centuries, there has been debate about whether the Ark existed in reality, but beyond its physical existence, there is a detail even more provocative: his functionality. Could a construction like that, with the dimensions and materials described, having really fulfilled its purpose? This documentary does not seek to repeat the history that already you know. It is not intended to discredit it either. What we will do is something different, go deeper in the hidden logic behind its design, analyze, point by point, how a structure built in the antique could having hosted a micro-civilization floating. To do so, we must put aside the childish image of the Ark as a floating zoo and begin to see it as what it possibly was a masterpiece of the engineering ancient, a living machine, designed not just to float, but to preserve. And it all starts by understanding its exterior, because the secret of its interior is hidden in its shape. For centuries, the skeptics have dismissed the story of the Ark as an impossible myth. How could a wooden structure withstand a storm of planetary proportions? How could keep stable in a ocean without costs, without course, without rest? The answer, surprisingly, could lie in mathematics. The book of Genesis describes the Ark with specific dimensions: 300 cubits long, 50 wide, and 30 high. Translated into current measurements, this is equivalent to approximately 135 meters long, 22.5 meters wide, and 13.5 meters high. These proportions are not arbitrary. In fact, modern hydrodynamicists have shown that these dimensions offer stability amazing in extreme conditions. Current cargo ships, they use similar proportions for their ability to support large masses without tipping over. It more curious is that, according to the biblical text, the Ark did not have rudder nor candles. It was not designed not to sail, but to float. Its sole purpose was to resist, to absorb the impact of the waves and stay safe. In other words, it was a survival platform, not a transportation platform. Knowledge necessary to conceive something like this was not common. It required understanding the balance, center of gravity, the strength of materials, and yet it is described as the work of a single man guided by divine instructions. Was Noah an intuitive engineer, or did he have access to forgotten knowledge? Many researchers believe that ancient cultures, such as the Egyptians, the Sumerians, or even the antediluvian peoples, possessed construction knowledge that we have underestimated. It is no coincidence that the 6:1 ratio, length versus width, used in the Ark, is also found in other ancient monuments. If the exterior of the Ark was designed with such precision, what we could discover by looking inside? The answer is found in his internal anatomy, the materials, the distribution of the spaces, and the decision structural elements that allowed that primitive ship to function as a self-sufficient system for more than an anus. If the Ark was a functional structure, its effectiveness depended not only on its external form, but also on how it was built from within. And it is here that the biblical story offers clues that, well interpreted, reveal a surprisingly logical advance. The text mentions that the Ark was built with gopher wood. No one knows for sure what species refers to, since this word appears only once in the entire Bible. However, many scholars suggest that it was cypress or cedar, two types of wood, known for their durability, water resistance, and relative lightness. Trees ideal for a structure that had to remain whole under constant pressure. But the choice of the material was only the beginning. The real secret was in the way that wood was assembled. Unlike a simple giant box, the Ark seems to have had a complex network of longitudinal and transverse beams designed to distribute the weight and absorb the movement of the surf without break. This technique, common in the modern naval architecture, would allow the boat resisted the tensions of a raging sea for months. In addition, the Ark was divided into 3 levels, each with specific functions. This vertical distribution not only maximized space, but it also helped to organize the animals according to size and needs, facilitating the access, the cleaning, and the control of the internal environment. Other detail. Essential was the use of bitumen, a substance similar to asphalt, to waterproof both the interior and exterior. This resource, available in the ancient Mesopotamia, acted as a natural sealant, protecting the wood of the humidity and the mushrooms. An ingenious solution, probably learned from river construction techniques of the time. Nothing in her design seemed improvised. Every decision responded to a logic of survival, as if the builder knew not only the challenges of the sea, but also the principles of a self-sustaining system. And if the physical structure was already surprising, what is hidden behind the animal logistics leads us to a level still deeper: planning. One of the most common criticisms of the Ark story is the apparent impossibility of housing all the animals of the world in a single ship. But this assumption is based on a modern era, thinking in terms of species rather than kinds. The Bible does not speak of species in a biological sense, but rather as types according to his class. In other words, it was not about carrying an African lion, a Siberian tiger, and an American jaguar, but a single feline representative of all of them. According to this approach, the more conservative studies estimate that the total number of animals on board would be around 6,800. A considerable number, yes, but far below the millions than many imagine. And there's more. The logic behind the selection also suggests that they were chosen specimens young, smaller, less demanding in feeding, easier to transport, and with greater reproductive potential at the end of the journey. A juvenile elephant takes up much less space, consumes less water, and produces less waste than an adult. The idea that the animals, they also came voluntarily, it has been a source of ridicule, but some researchers propose that natural phenomena, such as instinctive migrations, magnetic disturbances, or even sound signals, could have facilitated this phenomenon. If the history of the flood had a supernatural component, the migration would not be the hardest part to accept. Already on board, the organization was essential. Carnivorous animals were kept separate from herbivores, not only for safety, but to prevent stress and the smell of blood. The compartments were designed for size, behavior, and specific needs. Noah and his family were not zookeepers. They were managers of an ecosystem floating. Every movement, every space, every decision had a logic of efficiency. But even with few animals and a solid structure, how were they handled? The inevitable waste. The answer is even more surprising because the Ark hid an ingenious sanitation system centuries before the invention of modern sewerage. One of the older people challenges of having thousands of confined animals is not only feeding them, but also managing their waste. In a closed space, the accumulation of feces and urine can become lethal in a matter of days. And yet, the story does not mention any health collapse. As it resolved, some models proposed by modern engineers suggest that the Ark could have counted on slightly sloping floors, channeling the waste toward Channel's power plants that flowed in a common reservoir, gravity toward his work, and from there, the family could expel the waste manually to the outside, perhaps through a hatch designed for that purpose. This system was not only feasible, but would have required little intervention. Daily, reducing direct contact with the subject organic, a solution simple but effective. The other big problem was the air. With so many bodies breathing in a closed space, the oxygen could become exhausted quickly. But here comes another fascinating aspect of the design: the ventilation passive. The Bible mentions a window or opening that surrounded the top of the ark. That opening, in combination with ducts vertical, would have allowed the natural flow of air by convection. Hot, stale air rises. Fresh air enters through the bottom. It is the same principle used in many modern ecological constructions. This system, although rudimentary, it would have been enough to maintain oxygen at acceptable levels and reduce the accumulation of toxic gases such as ammonia or methane generated by the animals. Furthermore, being divided into 3 levels, the ark created differentiated pressure zones, helping further to distribute the air in a balanced manner. It was, in essence, of an intelligent circulation system, without motors or electricity. Each solution points to a functional knowledge of the environment, as if the design would have been carefully thought out to imitate a controlled ecosystem, a delicate balance between biology, physics, and survival. And while the air and the waste were managed, there were other constant challenges: the food. How was it stored? Food for hundreds of days. How was it distributed safely and securely? Waste. One of the most critical factors for the prolonged survival in any confinement is the food. It's not just about storing food, but also about preserving it, distributing it, and avoiding the waste. In the case of the ark, this meant feeding thousands of animals and 8 human beings for more than a year without cooling, without electricity, and without margin of error. The key was in the selection of the type of food. Ancient texts and logical reconstructions suggest that they were stored dried grains, hay, dried fruits, and seeds. All of these products, they have something in common: high durability and low risk of decay if kept dry and protected. But how were they preserved? The solution seems to have been the use of ceramic containers, sealed, some with valves or outlets dosing machines. This type of storage not only protected the foods of the humidity and rodents, but also allowed a precise control over the amount distributed. In essence, the ark counted with his own pantry organized by sections and by type of diet: carnivores, herbivores, and humans. In addition, it is likely that many of the provisions would have been sun-dried before the trip, an ancient preservation method that reduces the weight and the volume, maintaining essential nutrients. Even today, armies and expeditions they use similar principles. The distribution of the food, too, was designed with efficiency. Models have been proposed that propose gravity feed systems, in which the caretakers deposited food the top of a tube, which descended toward animal compartments. This avoided having to enter each cell, reducing direct contact and increasing the security. As for water, it is presumed that it was collected rain through gutter systems in the upper deck. The water was stored in sealed tanks and carefully rationed. What emerges from all this is not desperate improvisation, but planning, detailed, almost scientific. The ark, in its interior, was a store living where every resource was precious. But not everything was physical. There was a silent enemy lurking day and night: the noise, the confinement, the mental stress, and facing it, perhaps, was the elderly challenge for everyone. Is seldom a reflection on what it meant live locked up for 370 days, without escape, no horizon. Just wood, damp, darkness, and a constant roar of wildlife. The interior of the ark was not a peaceful sanctuary. It was an environment of constant psychological pressure. It is estimated that the noise level inside the ark could have reached 85 decibels, similar to that of a factory in operation. The roar of the animals, the creak of the wood under the tension, the pounding incessant of the water against the walls, everything contributed to a dense, persistent, almost unbearable. Under such conditions, the mental stress was not a risk. It was a certainty, and yet Noah and his family, they resisted. How? The answer may be a combination of factors: strict routine, deep faith, and gradual adaptation. It is likely that the day-by-day was divided into repetitive tasks and clear cycles, which helped to maintain the mind focused and avoid emotional collapse. Repetition in times of chaos can be an anchor. In addition, some areas of the Ark, and especially the human spaces, probably were reinforced with rudimentary sound insulation, using materials absorbents such as fabrics, straw, or even skins animals. They did not eliminate the noise, but it attenuated enough to allow rest. Added to this is the spiritual component. Noah was not a simple builder, was a man convinced that he is fulfilling his duty, a divine purpose. This moral and spiritual certainty becomes into a powerful force against the desperation. For his family, the faith was not an accessory, it was a survival tool. In that sense, the Ark also was a psychological laboratory, a place where the human mind was pushed to the limit, stripped of external distractions, forced to confront herself. And when they finally waters, they retreated, not just emerged bodies survivors. So too made a transformed humanity. A humanity that had to start over, with new rules, new customs, and a new way of life. When the waters finally receded and the Ark rested on solid ground, the world that Noah and his family they knew no longer existed. Everything that had been erased. The landscape, the atmosphere, the seasons, even the relationship of the human being with the nature. Everything had changed. The exit. The Ark was not just a physical act. It was a spiritual and biological transition towards a new stage of the humanity, an absolute reboot. One of the most notable transformations was the human diet. Before the flood, according to the biblical story, the men were vegetarians. But then, for the first time, they were allowed to eat meat. This wasn't just a decision practice, derived from an impoverished ecosystem. It was also a sign that the rules had changed. The relationship with the creation, it was no longer one of pure harmony, but of careful mastery and moral responsibility. In genetic terms, this new beginning, it was radical. The whole present-day human and animal diversity, according to this narrative, descends from the occupants of the Ark. This implies a new zero point in the cultural, spiritual, and civilizational evolution. The nations, the languages, the lineages. It all started again from a same origin. But beyond the biology, the most profound change was symbolic. The human being had witnessed the absolute judgment and of the total mercy. He had experienced the isolation, the shortage, the fear, and had survived. He came out of the Ark not like the same being that had entered, but as a memory bearer, a witness of what invisible Noah. Upon stepping on land again, he didn't build a house. He built an altar, and with that frame he knew covenant. One where the man should not only populate the earth, but to protect it, manage it, respect it. Thus, the Ark stopped being just a ship. It became in symbol, a reminder floating that the humanity, in his darkest moment, he was able to preserve life with obedience, wisdom, and purpose. But what does all this mean for us today? Is it just a story, ancient, or an eternal warning? After exploring every corner of the Ark, from its design structural to its psychological impact, a question remains suspended in the air. What if all this out true? What if the story of the flood were not just a symbolic myth, but the ancestral memory of a real catastrophe, carefully preserved in the form of history? What if the construction of the Ark was not an act of faith naive, but a work of engineering advanced that even surpasses the modern standards? What this analysis reveals is not a fantasy, it's a hypothesis, plausible, based in functional logic, scientific principles, and internal coherence. A ship of this size, with this level of planning, yes, could have complement its purpose, to preserve life in half from chaos. But beyond his technical feasibility, the Ark continues talking to us today as a symbol. It reminds us that the humanity, even in his point of greatest corruption and decay, can find redemption. May the preparation, discipline, and faith are not opposites, but allies. And if we look at the world today, with its ecological, moral, and spiritual crises, perhaps the message of the Ark is more relevant than ever. It's not just about surviving a literal flood, but about building spaces of resilience and hope in half from the collapse. Noah was not just a survivor. He was a founder of the future, and his history, beyond what you believe, continues to inspire those who dare to look beyond the obvious. So now the decision is yours. Were you surprised by this version of the Ark? Then subscribe, share this video with someone who still think it was just a children's story, and tell us in the comments, what other mystery ancient do you think I could have a forgotten explanation? Because the next big secret is already waiting to be revealed.